For centuries, the story of the Trojan War has captured the imagination of poets, historians, and dreamers alike. It is a tale of gods and mortals, love and betrayal, courage and deceit. At its heart lies a single spark, a golden apple inscribed for the fairest, a fateful contest between goddesses, and a prince's fateful choice that would ignite a conflict remembered for millennia. Imagine a world where heroes like Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus walked the earth, where the pride of kings clashed with the will of the gods, and where a single city became the stage for one of history's greatest epics. The walls of Troy stood tall, defying siege after siege, while alliances shifted, warriors fell, and legends were born. From the abduction of Helen to the cunning ruse of the wooden horse, every moment of this war was shaped by both divine intervention and human ambition. The Trojan War was not just a battle for a city, it was a struggle for glory, honor, and the eternal memory of men whose names would never be forgotten. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift into slumber, let this journey take you back over 3,000 years, to the windswept plains of Troy, where destiny awaited. Before we dive deeper into this epic saga, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a journey into the past that brings history to life, even while you sleep. The seeds of the Trojan War were sown long before the first sword was drawn or the first ship set sail. It began with a celebration in the heavens, a wedding that would become infamous for a single act of spite. The marriage of Peleus, a mortal hero, and Thetis, a sea goddess, was meant to unite divine and human realms. Gods and goddesses gathered upon Mount Olympus, adorned in their radiant glory, feasting and reveling under the watchful eyes of Zeus, the king of the gods. Yet not all had been invited. Eris, the goddess of discord, was deliberately excluded for her reputation of sowing chaos wherever she went. Eris, seething with resentment, arrived uninvited. In her hands she held a golden apple, its surface shining like the sun, bearing a simple but fateful inscription, "For the fairest." Without a word, she cast the apple among the assembled goddesses, and with that she vanished, leaving behind a room now thick with tension. 3 goddesses stepped forward to claim the apple: Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of power; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each believed she was the fairest and none would yield. Their argument escalated, voices sharp as the clashing of swords, until they turned to Zeus for judgment. Yet Zeus, wise enough to avoid entangling himself in their quarrel, refused. Instead, he appointed a mortal shepherd prince to settle the matter: Paris, the son of King Priam of Troy. Paris was no ordinary man. Though raised as a shepherd in the hills of Mount Ida, he was of royal blood. His destiny, unknown to him then, was about to intertwine with that of nations. The goddesses approached Paris, each determined to sway his choice. Hera promised him vast power, dominion over mighty lands and the throne of kings. Athena offered him unmatched wisdom and skill in war, the ability to conquer his enemies and be remembered as the greatest of warriors. Aphrodite, however, spoke not of power or glory but of love. She promised him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife, Helen of Sparta. Paris, young and impressionable, was captivated by the vision Aphrodite painted. Helen's beauty was already famed across the Greek world, though she was wed to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Blinded by desire and persuaded by the promise of a love unlike any other, Paris placed the golden apple into Aphrodite's hands. Thus, the judgment of Paris was made, and with it, the fate of Troy was sealed. The choice angered Hera and Athena deeply, for they were goddesses not known to forgive such slights. Their wrath would soon manifest in the great conflict to come, as they aligned themselves against Paris and the city of Troy. Meanwhile, Aphrodite, triumphant, guided Paris toward his prize. Through her divine machinations, Paris was welcomed to the court of Menelaus under the guise of diplomacy. There, he laid eyes upon Helen, and with the goddess's aid, he persuaded her to leave her husband and elope with him to Troy. The act was more than a theft of a woman, it was a theft of honor. Among the Greeks, hospitality was sacred, and to betray the trust of one's host was a grievous insult. Menelaus, humiliated and enraged, called upon his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and together they invoked the oath sworn by Helen's former suitors, an oath to defend her marriage and avenge any wrong done to it. Thus, the leaders of Greece were bound to assemble, not merely for love, but for the honor of their kings and the pride of their people. As Paris sailed back to Troy with Helen beside him, the winds whispered of war. The gods, too, began to choose their sides, Olympus itself divided by the quarrel that had begun with a single apple. In the halls of Troy, King Priam welcomed his son, unaware that the woman Paris brought with him would become the cause of their city's downfall. Queen Hecuba's dreams, which once foretold that her son would bring ruin, now echoed ominously in the corridors of the royal palace. This moment, the spark of fate, was not merely a story of love and betrayal, it was the prelude to an age-defining war. The apple of discord had done its work, setting in motion a series of events that would summon 1,000 ships, call forth heroes of legend, and echo across the centuries in song and story. The story of the Trojan War moves forward with the event that turned whispers of fate into the roar of inevitable conflict. Helen of Sparta, the woman whose beauty was said to rival that of the goddesses, became the central figure in a decision that would ignite one of the greatest wars of the ancient world. Her departure from Sparta, whether by choice or by force, is remembered as the abduction of Helen. But this moment was not born in isolation. It was the result of a chain of choices, promises, and desires that had already been set in motion when Paris, Prince of Troy, was chosen to judge the beauty of the goddesses in the fateful contest known as the Judgment of Paris. Paris had been promised the love of the most beautiful woman in the world by the goddess Aphrodite. That promise now led him to the shores of Sparta. Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, was not only renowned for her beauty but also for her position as the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta, brother of the powerful King Agamemnon of Mycenae. Menelaus and Helen had lived a life that, from the outside, seemed stable. Their marriage had also been the result of great political maneuvering. Before Helen married Menelaus, many suitors from all over Greece had sought her hand. To avoid bloodshed among those competing suitors, her stepfather, King Tyndareus, had made them swear an oath that whoever was chosen as her husband would be supported by all others, and if anyone attempted to take her away, all the suitors would unite to retrieve her. It was this very oath that would soon drag Greece into war. When Paris arrived in Sparta under the pretense of diplomacy, he was welcomed warmly by Menelaus. Hospitality, or xenia, was sacred in Greek culture, and to betray it was one of the greatest possible offenses. Paris, young and handsome, was received as a guest of honor. During Menelaus' temporary absence, he had to leave Sparta for Crete to attend a funeral. Paris saw his opportunity. Accounts differ as to how Helen was taken. In some tellings, Aphrodite herself inflamed Helen's heart with irresistible desire for Paris, making her leave willingly. In others, Paris abducted her against her will, seizing both her and the treasures of Sparta before sailing back to Troy. The departure of Helen was a moment of both scandal and destiny. For some, she was a victim, a pawn in the games of gods and men. For others, she was a willing participant in a love that defied marriage, duty, and the bonds of her homeland. Ancient poets often debated her role. Was she the cause of the war or simply its excuse? Whatever the truth, the consequence was the same. Her absence was an insult to the honor of Menelaus and by extension to all of Greece. When Menelaus returned to find his queen gone, rage consumed him. The betrayal was not only personal but political. Helen was more than a wife, she was a symbol of alliance and prestige. Losing her meant losing face in front of every rival king who had once desired her hand. Menelaus immediately sought the counsel of his elder brother Agamemnon, whose power extended across much of Greece. Agamemnon, ambitious and always eager for greater glory, saw in this a chance to unite the Greek kingdoms under one cause, to retrieve Helen and punish Troy. Word spread across Greece, and the oath once sworn by Helen's suitors was invoked. Men who had once sought her hand now gathered in arms to avenge the insult done to Menelaus. Among them were the greatest names of the Greek heroic age: Odysseus of Ithaca, Ajax of Salamis, Nestor of Pylos, Diomedes of Argos, and the unmatched warrior Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis. Each had their own reasons, honor, glory, or duty, but the spark had been lit. Meanwhile, in Troy, Helen's arrival was met with mixed feelings. The Trojan royal family was divided over Paris's actions. King Priam, though welcoming of his son, knew that harboring Helen would bring the wrath of the Greeks. Hector, Paris's elder brother and the greatest warrior of Troy, openly criticized Paris for his reckless choice, warning that no good would come from a love won by betrayal. But Paris, blinded by passion and bolstered by Aphrodite's promise, refused to give her up. The gods themselves were already taking sides. Hera and Athena, scorned by Paris during his judgment, favored the Greeks, while Aphrodite stood firmly by Paris and Troy. The abduction of Helen thus became the formal beginning of enmity between the two great powers. Trade routes that once carried goods now carried rumors of war. Envoys were sent to Troy demanding Helen's return, but Paris refused, claiming love and destiny as his shield. Priam, though a wise and seasoned ruler, allowed his son's decision to stand, believing that the will of the gods could not be overturned. For Helen, the journey from Sparta to Troy was one of no return. Ancient sources describe her as walking the halls of Troy like a woman caught between two worlds. Some claimed she grew to love her new city and her new husband. Others said she spent every night regretting the moment she left Sparta, cursing the gods who had played with her fate. Whatever her heart truly felt, her presence in Troy sealed its destiny. The abduction marked more than just the loss of a queen. It was the tearing of a fragile peace that had barely held the Greek world together. Kings who had once been rivals were now allies in war. Armies began to muster, ships to be built, and the name of Helen became the rallying cry for vengeance. Thus the stage was set. What began as a journey of love, or perhaps of lust and divine manipulation, was now the spark that would engulf cities, topple heroes, and write an epic that would echo for millennia. Helen had left Sparta, and with her departure, Greece left behind the calm before the storm. The Greek expedition to Troy was not a single fleet but a coalition of many, each led by a chieftain who had sworn an oath to defend the honor of Menelaus and reclaim Helen. Once the forces were assembled at Aulis, the task of crossing the treacherous Aegean Sea lay ahead. The winds, the currents, and the will of the gods would shape their journey. The voyage to Troy was neither swift nor simple. It became a trial in itself, testing the resolve of the men and their leaders even before they reached the battlefield. The fleet, according to the ancient traditions, consisted of over 1,000 ships, a number that symbolized both the vastness of the Greek alliance and the scale of their ambition. Warriors from Mycenae, Sparta, Ithaca, Pylos, and many other kingdoms embarked on this campaign. The sea, however, was not a neutral element. The Aegean was a domain watched over by Poseidon, god of the sea, and influenced by the whims of other deities who either favored or despised the Greek cause. As the ships prepared to depart, an ill omen troubled their mission. The winds were calm to the point of stagnation, and the fleet lay stranded in the harbor. Days turned to weeks and the army grew restless. Supplies dwindled, morale wavered, and doubts began to surface. The cause was said to be the anger of the goddess Artemis, who had been offended by Agamemnon, the commander of the host. According to the seers, the only way to appease her and grant the fleet a fair wind was through a grim sacrifice, Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. This moment became one of the most haunting preludes to the war. Agamemnon faced the impossible choice between a father's love and a commander's duty. Myths tell of how he lured Iphigenia to Aulis under the guise of a wedding to the hero Achilles, only to present her for sacrifice upon the altar of Artemis. Some legends claim the goddess spared the girl at the last moment, replacing her with a deer. Others insist that the blade fell and her blood bought the wind that carried the fleet. Whichever version is true, the event marked the expedition with a shadow of blood and tragedy before it had even begun. With the winds finally rising, the ships set sail. The Aegean Sea stretched before them, glittering under the sun by day and shrouded in mist by night. Navigating the islands and rocky coasts was treacherous, and the fleet often became scattered. Storms would strike without warning, scattering ships across distant shores. Some kings, like Odysseus of Ithaca, were skilled in seamanship and used the stars and currents to guide their men. Others relied on luck and the prayers of their priests. One of the most famous detours involved the hero Achilles and his myrmidons. According to certain versions, their ship was driven off course and landed in Mysia, where they clashed with King Telephus. The skirmish wounded the king, but the Greeks gained little from the delay. Another account tells of Philoctetes, who was bitten by a serpent during a stop at Lemnos and abandoned there due to the stench of his wound, a decision that would have great consequences later in the war. The journey was also marked by divine interference. Hera and Athena, who favored the Greek cause, sought to protect the fleet, while Aphrodite, the patron of Paris, and Apollo often worked against them. Poseidon's mood was unpredictable. Though he bore a grudge against Troy, his domain was the sea, and no mortal could cross it without paying respect. Sacrifices of bulls and rams were offered upon the decks, their blood spilled into the waves as offerings to secure safe passage. The men endured cramped conditions aboard their vessels, sleeping under the open sky, with only salted fish and dry bread to sustain them. Disease often spread in such close quarters, and tempers flared among the various kings and their followers. Old rivalries resurfaced. Some resented the authority of Agamemnon, others doubted the worthiness of the cause. The sea, indifferent to their quarrels, continued to test their unity. At last, after many delays, storms, and scattered landings, the bulk of the fleet sighted the shores of Asia Minor. The coastline of Troy appeared, a distant line upon the horizon, crowned with its fabled walls. But their arrival was not yet the beginning of the war. The Greeks first made landfall not at Troy itself, but at nearby shores, raiding smaller towns to gather provisions and to test the strength of the Trojans' allies. These early skirmishes were brutal. Villages were burned, men were slain, and women were taken as spoils. Among the captives was Chryseis, daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo, whose capture would later spark one of the fiercest quarrels among the Greek leaders. The war had not even formally begun, yet already the seeds of discord were sown within the Greek camp. For the Trojans, the sight of the vast fleet assembling along their coast was a harbinger of the storm to come. Messengers were sent to neighboring allies, Dardanians, Lycians, Phrygians, to muster their defense. Priam, the aged king of Troy, consulted his sons and counselors. Some urged negotiation, others prepared for siege. Paris, whose abduction of Helen had sparked this war, stood defiant, shielded by the favor of Aphrodite. Thus, the voyage to Troy ended, but the true war had yet to begin. The Greeks, weathered by sea and sacrifice, had reached their destination, but their unity was fragile, their fates already entangled in the schemes of gods and the consequences of choices made along the way. The sea had not destroyed them, but it had shaped them, binding them together with loss, delay, and the haunting memory of the price paid to set sail. The voyage to Troy was more than a passage across waters. It was the first chapter in a saga of endurance. It revealed the cost of their oaths, the meddling of divine forces, and the resilience required to pursue vengeance across the uncertain paths of fate. For many of those who disembarked upon Trojan soil, the sea they had crossed would never again be sailed, only remembered in tales told by the few who returned. As the Greek armada finally anchored upon the shores near Troy, the tension that had been building for years erupted into the first sparks of open warfare. The massive fleet, gathered from every corner of Greece, carried with it not only soldiers and kings but also the burden of oaths, pride, and vengeance. The Trojans, forewarned of their arrival, had not been idle. Their city, Ilium, with its towering walls and fortified gates, stood as a challenge to the greatest military coalition the Aegean world had ever seen. The first days were marked by swift landings and frantic attempts to establish a foothold. The Greeks, led by Agamemnon, knew that to wage a prolonged siege, they would need control of the beaches and surrounding plains. Patrols and outposts were set, while supply lines were secured from their fleet. The Trojans, under the wise counsel of their elder king Priam, did not rush into full-scale battle. They relied instead on the imposing walls designed by the gods themselves, walls that legend claimed Poseidon and Apollo had once built during their servitude to the mortal king Laomedon. Skirmishes erupted as the Greeks tested the Trojan defenses. Heroes such as Ajax, Diomedes, and Odysseus led early raids upon the outlying settlements and farmlands, hoping to cut off Troy from its agricultural lifelines. These early attacks brought spoils and captives, but they did not bring the decisive victory the Greeks so desperately sought. The Trojans, with Hector, Aeneas, and other champions, launched counter-raids, harassing Greek positions and pushing them back toward their ships. The battlefield in these early years of the war was not a single front but a shifting, chaotic series of engagements. Streams of chariots and foot soldiers clashed upon the dusty plains of the Scamander River. Spears flew, shields clanged, and the cries of warriors echoed across the fields, but neither side gained true dominance. The Greeks, though numerous, faced disunity among their leaders. Each king commanded his own contingent, and rivalries often flared. Agamemnon's pride clashed with Achilles' fierce independence. Odysseus counseled caution while Menelaus demanded haste to reclaim his stolen wife. Troy too suffered internal strain. The city was a beacon of wealth and culture, drawing allies from across Anatolia and the eastern lands, but its coalition was fragile. Princes from nearby regions lent their arms, yet their loyalty was often swayed by promises or fear. King Priam's sons, Hector, Paris, Deiphobus, each had their own visions of how the war should be fought. Paris, whose abduction of Helen had lit the spark of war, avoided the front lines when he could, preferring the safety of the city walls and the company of Helen. During this time, diplomacy did not vanish entirely. Envoys were sent. Odysseus himself, accompanied by Menelaus, entered Troy under a flag of truce in an attempt to negotiate Helen's return. Priam received them with dignity, but Paris refused to give up the woman whose beauty had become both his prize and his curse. Thus, the hope of an early settlement dissolved, and the conflict entrenched itself deeper. The landscape around Troy transformed. Fields once fertile turned to wastelands scorched by raids. Villages that had supplied the city for generations were reduced to ashes. The Greeks established fortified camps along the shore, their ships drawn up and protected by walls of their own. These encampments became semi-permanent cities, buzzing with the life of warriors, craftsmen, and slaves taken in raids. As seasons turned, the war began to stretch into years, its initial momentum lost in the grind of attrition. Among the Greeks, heroes sought to make their names immortal through bold exploits. Diomedes became a scourge upon the Trojan allies, winning duels and even daring to wound the gods themselves. Aphrodite, who favored Paris, was said to have been struck by his spear during a clash. Ajax, massive and steadfast, earned renown for holding the line when others faltered. Odysseus, ever cunning, began laying the groundwork for future stratagems, observing the city and its defenders, planning not just for days but for the war's uncertain future. The Trojans, under Hector's leadership, did not remain purely defensive. They launched sorties that tested Greek strength, sometimes pushing them perilously close to their ships. Hector, unlike his brother Paris, was a warrior of honor and responsibility. His presence on the battlefield inspired the Trojan forces and reminded them that their homes, their families, and their gods were worth fighting for. Yet, he too understood the strain. A city under siege could not endure forever without relief or victory. The gods, as always in the tales of Troy, played their roles with shifting loyalties. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, angered by Paris' judgment in the contest of the Golden Apple. Aphrodite, Apollo, and Ares leaned toward the Trojans, shielding Paris and guiding Trojan arrows. Zeus, the king of the gods, sought balance, letting neither side win too easily, for the war was as much a game of divine rivalry as it was a contest of mortals. As the first major clashes ended without resolution, a grim reality settled upon both camps. The war would not end swiftly. The Greeks, though fierce and numerous, could not breach the walls of Ilium by force alone. The Trojans, though defiant and skilled, could not drive the Greeks back into the sea. Stalemate became the defining feature of these early years, a grinding, consuming conflict that drained both sides but fed the legends that would echo for centuries. In the Greek camp, disputes grew. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, clashed with Agamemnon over spoils of war and the distribution of honor. This quarrel, though yet to reach its infamous peak, planted the seeds of dissent that would later threaten the entire expedition. The morale of the men wavered, for many had left their homes believing they would return within a season. Now winters passed upon the foreign shore and Troy still loomed untouched, its gates unbroken. Within the city, life continued under the shadow of war. Markets reopened between sieges, children grew up knowing only the sound of distant battles, and priests offered sacrifices to placate the gods. Helen, the woman at the heart of the conflict, walked the high walls with mixed emotions, guilt for the suffering she had caused, sorrow for the lives lost, and a strange attachment to the city that had become her reluctant home. Thus, the early years of the Trojan War were marked not by glorious conquest or decisive battles, but by a harsh equilibrium. Each side bled, each side plotted, and each side waited, for reinforcements, for omens, for a turn of fate that would shift the tide. The Greeks held the shore, the Trojans held the city, and the plain between them became a graveyard of ambition. This was the stage upon which the greater tragedies and triumphs of the war would soon unfold. The wrath of Achilles still simmered beneath the surface. The cunning of Odysseus had yet to find its masterpiece. The gods had yet to unleash their full fury. And the walls of Ilium, ancient and unyielding, still cast their long shadow over the blood-soaked earth. The siege of Troy had dragged on for years, and though the Greek army was vast and its heroes renowned, the war had become a grinding stalemate. Tempers flared as the endless fighting wore down the patience of even the greatest warriors. Among them was Achilles, the unmatched champion of the Greeks, fierce in battle and proud in spirit. At the heart of the Greek camp, an insult was about to ignite a chain of events that would shape the fate of the entire war. It began with a dispute over spoils of war. After a successful raid on a nearby city allied to Troy, the Greek leaders divided the treasures and captives among themselves. Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces and king of Mycenae, claimed a woman named Chryseis as his prize. Her father, a Trojan priest of Apollo, came to the Greek camp offering ransom to free her. When Agamemnon arrogantly refused and insulted the old man, Apollo unleashed a devastating plague upon the Greek army. Warriors fell ill, fires burned on the funeral pyres day and night, and the morale of the Greeks began to crumble. A council of leaders was called to address the crisis. Odysseus, wise and cunning, spoke of returning Chryseis to her father to appease Apollo and end the suffering. Many agreed, seeing the necessity of the act, but Agamemnon's pride was wounded. Reluctantly, he agreed to return the girl but declared that he would take another prize in her place to show that no one could dishonor the high king without consequence. His words were laced with arrogance and threat. Achilles, already chafing under Agamemnon's authority, could bear no more. He stood before the council and accused Agamemnon of being a selfish and dishonorable leader, caring more for his pride than for the good of the army. The two men exchanged heated words, their voices rising like clashing swords. In a moment that would change the course of the war, Agamemnon publicly insulted Achilles and, in a show of dominance, declared he would seize Achilles' prize of honor, the maiden Briseis. When the soldiers of Agamemnon came to take Briseis from his tent, Achilles stood in silence, his hands clenched, his heart aflame with rage. To kill Agamemnon outright would be to tear apart the Greek coalition, but to suffer the insult without response was unbearable. Torn between his fury and his duty, Achilles made a fateful decision. He would withdraw from the war entirely. He and his Myrmidon warriors would no longer fight for the Greeks. In his tent, Achilles raised his hands to the heavens and called upon his mother, Thetis, the sea goddess. He begged her to go to Zeus, king of the gods, and ask him to favor the Trojans for a time, to push the Greeks to the brink of defeat so they would realize how much they needed him. Thetis, sorrowful for her son's suffering, agreed. She knew that Achilles was fated for greatness but also for a short life, and every choice he made brought him closer to that destiny. As the days passed, the war shifted. Without Achilles on the battlefield, the Trojans grew bolder. Hector, prince of Troy and the city's greatest warrior, led daring raids against the Greek fortifications. The morale of the Greek army faltered, their losses mounted, and whispers spread that the war might be lost. All the while, Achilles remained in his tent, his anger smoldering like a fire denied air, waiting for the moment when the Greeks would come to him, humbled and desperate. This moment, the insult of Agamemnon, the wrath of Achilles, and his withdrawal from the war, was more than a quarrel between two men. It was a turning point in the Trojan War, setting in motion the chain of tragedies and heroics that would follow. Achilles' rage, born of wounded honor, would not cool easily, and its consequences would echo across the plains of Ilium. The long and bitter war at Troy had already taken a heavy toll on both the Greeks and the Trojans. Years had passed since the first Greek ships landed on the shores of Ilium, and still the walls of Troy stood firm. Skirmishes and raids had become a grim routine, but now a great imbalance threatened the Greek army. Achilles, the greatest of their warriors, remained withdrawn in anger, refusing to fight because of the insult dealt by Agamemnon. Without his presence, the tide of battle began to turn in favor of the Trojans. The armies clashed day after day under the scorching sun and the dust-laden winds of the plains. Hector, prince of Troy, led his forces with valor and determination, driving the Greeks back toward their ships. The once confident Greek warriors now found themselves on the defensive, their morale waning as Trojan forces pressed harder. Achilles, in his tent, watched with growing unease but held firm to his anger, vowing not to return until his honor was restored. Among those closest to Achilles was Patroclus, a friend bound to him by deep loyalty and affection. Patroclus had fought alongside Achilles since their youth and understood his heart better than most. He saw the despair spreading through the Greek camp, the wounded piling up, the cries of the dying carried by the sea breeze, and he could no longer bear to watch his people fall. His concern was not for his own glory but for the survival of their army. One evening, as the Trojans pushed dangerously close to the Greek ships, Patroclus entered Achilles' tent. The great warrior sat brooding, his armor gleaming faintly in the dim light of the oil lamps. Patroclus knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Achilles," he said, "the Greeks are faltering. Our ships may burn before the sun rises again. If you will not fight, then at least let me lead your men, the Myrmidons, into battle. Lend me your armor so the Trojans will believe you have returned to the field. Their courage will falter and we may turn them back." Achilles gazed at his friend, torn between pride and the love he bore for him. For a moment, his anger softened. He knew Patroclus was brave and skilled, yet he also knew the fate that loomed over them. His mother, Thetis, had once told him of his destiny, that his life would be short but his name eternal. Still, his honor warred with his sense of duty. At last Achilles spoke. "Take my armor, Patroclus. Lead the Myrmidons and drive them from the ships. But hear me well, do not chase them to the walls of Troy. Once the ships are safe, return to me. Do not let the desire for glory overtake you." Patroclus nodded, accepting both the responsibility and the warning. That night, the Myrmidons prepared for battle under the cover of darkness. The camp stirred with a sense of hope as the news spread. Achilles had returned, or so they believed. When dawn broke, the sight of the familiar armor filled the Greeks with renewed courage. As the Myrmidons charged into the fray, their war cry split the air. The Trojans, believing Achilles himself had returned, faltered. Hector and his captains were momentarily thrown into confusion. The battle raged fiercely by the ships, bronze clashing against bronze, shields splintering and spears flying like deadly rain. Patroclus fought with the strength of a lion, his spear finding its mark time and again. The Greeks rallied behind him, pushing the Trojans back from the burning hulls of their ships. The tide of war turned sharply that day. Patroclus drove the Trojans before him, his heart swelling with the thrill of victory. In his fervor, he began to forget Achilles' warning. The enemy was retreating, the field was theirs, why stop now? His blood was hot, his spirit aflame, and the gates of Troy loomed ahead. Hector, realizing the deception, rallied his men at the foot of the Scaean gates. Among the defenders stood Sarpedon, a son of Zeus and one of the mightiest Trojan allies. Patroclus met him in combat, their spears striking and shields shattering. The ground beneath them was slick with blood as they fought. In a fierce exchange, Patroclus struck Sarpedon down, and the Trojans wailed at the fall of their champion. But the death of Sarpedon only inflamed Hector's resolve. He called upon his charioteer to drive him into the thick of battle, where Patroclus fought on, now consumed by the fire of conquest. His Myrmidons followed, but their formation began to thin as they pressed too far. Zeus, watching from Olympus, saw his son Sarpedon fall and wept tears of blood upon the battlefield. He had long known the threads of fate were woven, and now he turned his gaze to Patroclus. The hour of destiny was near. Patroclus, in the armor of Achilles, now faced Hector himself. The two warriors clashed, the sound of their blows echoing across the plain. Hector's spear struck first, wounding Patroclus but not felling him. As the struggle continued, the god Apollo, who favored Troy, struck Patroclus from behind, dazing him and knocking his helmet loose. The helmet of Achilles rolled into the dust. Seizing the moment, Hector drove his spear into Patroclus' chest. The Greek hero fell, his blood staining the earth, his breath ragged. As life slipped from him, Patroclus spoke his final words. "You have bested me, Hector, but it was not you alone who brought my end. Apollo struck me first and fate guided your spear. But know this, Achilles will return and your death will come soon at his hands." Hector stood over the fallen warrior, his chest heaving, his hands trembling around the shaft of his spear. The Trojans rejoiced at the fall of the man they believed was Achilles, but as they drew near, they realized the truth. It was not the son of Peleus who lay dead but his dearest companion. The Myrmidons fought fiercely to recover Patroclus' body, their grief fueling their blades. Menelaus, Ajax, and others of the Greek host arrived to hold back the Trojans as the tide of battle surged once more around the fallen hero. Hector stripped the body of its magnificent armor, Achilles' own, and claimed it as a trophy, a fateful act that would seal his doom. Back in his tent, Achilles awaited news. When the messenger came, his words were heavy as lead. Patroclus was dead. For a moment, the world seemed to fall silent around Achilles. The anger that had kept him apart now turned to grief so fierce it threatened to consume him. He fell to the ground, tearing his hair, covering his face with ash, his cries rising to the heavens. Thetis heard her son's lament from the depths of the sea and came to comfort him. She knew that this moment would drive him back to the battlefield, though it would also hasten his own death. Achilles swore a terrible oath upon the body of Patroclus. He would return to the fight, he would avenge his friend, and he would not rest until Hector lay dead and the Trojans paid in blood. The body of Patroclus was borne back to the Greek camp with honor, guarded by his comrades. The warriors wept for their fallen companion and funeral rites were prepared. Achilles refused food and rest, sitting beside the bier, his hand upon the cold hand of his friend. This death changed the course of the war. It stirred Achilles from his rage and brought him back to the battlefield, where his wrath would fall upon the Trojans like a storm. But the cost was great. Patroclus' sacrifice was one of loyalty and love, but it was also a turning point that sealed the fate of many, including Achilles himself. In the days to come, the plains of Troy would once again echo with the clash of arms, but the shadow of Patroclus' death would linger over them all, a reminder that even the greatest warriors cannot escape the threads of destiny. The death of Patroclus sent a shiver through the Greek camp. News of his fall spread like wildfire among the warriors, and the once roaring battlefield grew heavy with the weight of tragedy. Patroclus had been more than a companion to Achilles. He had been his closest friend, his confidant, and the soul that kept his wrath tethered. When word reached Achilles, the man who had withdrawn from the war in anger against Agamemnon, the proud hero of the Myrmidons fell into a storm of grief and guilt. Achilles tore at his hair, his voice breaking as he cursed the gods for their cruelty. He mourned not only the loss of Patroclus but the role he had played in his death. His refusal to fight had left the Greeks desperate, his absence had emboldened the Trojans, and in donning Achilles' armor, Patroclus had stepped into a role that was never truly his to bear. The thought burned Achilles' heart like fire. He sat in his tent, weeping over the news as Thetis, his mother and the sea goddess, rose from the waves to comfort her son. She held him, her immortal hands cool against his fevered brow, and whispered the truth he already knew. His path was now set. To avenge Patroclus he must return to battle. But Thetis warned him that this would also seal his fate. Once Hector fell by his hand, Achilles' own death would not be far behind. Achilles did not flinch. Vengeance was all that remained to him. Glory and life had always stood at opposite ends of the same road, and now he chose the one that burned brightest. The Greek camp stirred as Achilles called the Myrmidons to arms. His voice was no longer one of anger but of grim purpose. He would not eat, nor sleep, nor take comfort until Hector lay dead before him. Yet his armor was gone, taken by Patroclus and now captured by Hector as a trophy of war. He could not enter battle unarmed. Thetis, seeing her son's resolve, ascended once more to the depths of the sea and sought the forge of Hephaestus, the god of fire and craftsmanship. There, in the smoking halls of the divine blacksmith, she begged for a new set of armor befitting the might of Achilles. Hephaestus, moved by her plea and stirred by the glory of the coming vengeance, crafted a masterpiece, a shield that bore the world upon it, a breastplate that gleamed like the sun, greaves of unbreakable bronze, and a helm crowned with a horsehair plume that shimmered like flame. When Thetis returned with the armor, the Greeks beheld it in awe. Its brilliance lit the night as if a second dawn had risen. Achilles armed himself, and in that moment he seemed more a god than a man, a force of destiny moving toward the walls of Troy. Before battle, Achilles sought Agamemnon. The rift between them had cost too many lives, and Achilles, though still wounded in pride, offered truce. They spoke of their quarrel, of the rage that had set the war aflame, and agreed to set their differences aside. Gifts were offered, apologies made, but for Achilles, these were ashes compared to the blood of Patroclus. Then came the dawn. The sun rose red over the plains of Ilium as Achilles led the Greeks to war. The Trojans, emboldened by their recent victories, were unprepared for the storm that now approached. Achilles did not fight as a man that day. He fought as if the gods themselves had loosed him upon the world. His spear flashed, his chariot wheels tore furrows in the dust, and the river Scamander ran red with Trojan blood. He cut down warriors by the dozen. No plea was heard, no ransom accepted. The vengeance he sought was a tide, and all who stood before him were swept away. The Trojans, seeing the wrath of Achilles returned, faltered. Panic gripped their ranks, and the gates of Troy were thrown open to call the soldiers home. But Hector did not run. From the walls he watched the destruction unfold, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the storm he had awakened. Priam, the aged king of Troy, and Hecuba, the queen, begged him to stay within the safety of the walls. "Do not meet him, my son," they pleaded. "No man can stand against Achilles now." But Hector's honor and duty bound him. He had slain Patroclus. The weight of that act lay upon his shoulders, and he knew the vengeance of Achilles would not end until one of them lay dead upon the field. As the sun reached its zenith, the two warriors' fates drew closer. Achilles, his eyes burning with grief and fury, called out for Hector upon the plains. His voice echoed against the walls, a challenge that shook the hearts of all who heard it. Hector, torn between fear and duty, stepped down from the battlements. His knees trembled, his heart pounded like a drum, but he could not remain behind stone while the man he had wronged roamed free. He kissed his wife Andromache, and his young son for what he knew might be the last time, and he strode to the gates. The battlefield fell silent as the two figures approached one another, each the champion of his people, each the instrument of the god's design. Hector stood upon the plain, the walls of Troy behind him and the sea of Greeks before him. The wind tugged at his horsehair plume as he tightened his grip upon his spear. Across the field, Achilles bore down, his chariot drawn by the immortal horses Xanthos and Balios, their hooves drumming a terrible rhythm upon the earth. Hector felt the urge to flee rise within him like a cold tide, but pride chained his feet. 3 times he circled the walls of Troy as Achilles pursued, the two of them locked in a dance of life and death while the gods looked on from Olympus. Athena, ever the ally of the Greeks, took pity on Achilles and in the guise of Hector's brother Deiphobus, tricked Hector into stopping. Believing his brother stood at his side, Hector turned to face his fate. But when Achilles approached, spear in hand, Hector saw no ally beside him, only empty air. The trap had been set, and the gods had chosen their champion. They clashed with a roar that echoed across the plain. Spears were thrown, shields splintered, and swords flashed in the sun. Hector fought bravely, his strikes guided by desperation and skill, but Achilles was beyond mortal strength that day. Guided by rage and vengeance, he drove his spear into Hector's neck, the only gap in his armor. Hector fell, his life spilling into the dust of his homeland. As he lay dying, he begged Achilles to return his body to Troy for proper burial. But Achilles, his heart still hardened, refused. "There will be no ransom, no mourning," he said. "You shall be meat for the dogs and birds." With that, he stripped Hector of his own armor once worn by Patroclus, and tied the body to his chariot. Before the walls of Troy, before the eyes of Priam and Andromache, Achilles dragged Hector's corpse through the dust, a gesture of fury that turned triumph into desecration. The Trojans wailed from the ramparts as their champion was defiled. Andromache, seeing her husband's body dragged across the plain, fainted with grief. Priam covered his head in ashes, his cries echoing across the city. The fall of Hector marked the beginning of Troy's true downfall. Without its greatest defender, the city's fate was sealed. But even as Achilles' wrath burned hottest, the gods began to turn their gaze. Apollo, who had long favored the Trojans, was angered by the dishonor done to Hector's corpse. Even Zeus, king of the gods, frowned upon such cruelty. Night fell, and Achilles sat in his tent, Patroclus' funeral still to come. He wept over his friend's body, vowing that Hector's death was but the first step in a greater vengeance. The Greeks prepared a pyre for Patroclus, sacrifices were made and games were held in his honor. Chariot races thundered across the sands, wrestlers grappled and archers loosed their arrows, all to pay tribute to the fallen companion. Yet amid the fires of mourning, Achilles' heart found no peace. The prophecy spoken by his mother now loomed larger than ever. His own death would follow soon. And so the war pressed on, the shadow of fate lengthening over both camps. The death of Hector did not end the conflict, but it broke the spirit of Troy. The city's gates, once guarded by its mightiest son, now stood open to the slow, creeping doom that would come in the shape of the wooden horse and the Greeks' final ruse. Achilles had avenged Patroclus, but in doing so, he had sown the seeds of his own end. His glory was unmatched, his name would echo through the ages, but his days were numbered, and the gods had already begun to weave the threads of his doom. The fall of Hector was not merely a personal victory, it was a turning point in the war. The Greeks rallied behind their fiercest warrior, and the Trojans mourned their lost champion. The plains of Ilium, once filled with the sounds of clashing armies, now lay heavy with the silence of prophecy. And in the darkness of Troy's halls, Andromache held her child and wept, knowing that the future that awaited them would be written in fire and blood. After years of bloodshed, loss, and shattered dreams, the war before the walls of Troy had dragged on far longer than anyone imagined. The Greeks, once filled with youthful fire, were weary of the endless cycle of assaults and retreats. Supplies had dwindled, alliances had strained, and even the mightiest warriors were scarred by fatigue and grief. Yet the city of Troy stood unbroken, its high walls casting long shadows across the plains. The sons of Priam had endured the loss of Hector, their greatest defender, but the city itself remained unconquered. Achilles, the Greeks' greatest champion, had fallen too, struck down by Paris with an arrow guided by Apollo. The war seemed to have consumed the best of both sides, and still, no end was in sight. In the Greek camp, a council of war was called. Odysseus, known for his cunning mind rather than brute strength, proposed a plan that would forever mark his name in history. Direct assaults had failed, sieges had cost thousands of lives, and the gods themselves seemed to play both sides. Only deception, he argued, could achieve what 10 years of war could not. His idea was simple in concept but audacious in execution. A massive wooden horse, hollow within, large enough to carry a select group of Greek warriors, would be built as an offering to the gods, a supposed gift of surrender. This was not to be a mere statue, it was to be a symbol, a snare cloaked in reverence. The Greeks would pretend to abandon their camp, leaving behind the horse as a dedication to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, hoping to earn her favor for their safe voyage home. The rest of the army would sail away, but only out of sight, hiding behind the nearby island of Tenedos. At night, the hidden warriors inside the horse would emerge, open the gates of Troy and signal their fleet to return. The plan divided the Greek leaders. Some feared it was too risky, others doubted the Trojans would fall for such a ruse. Yet desperation, as it often does in long wars, overruled hesitation. The Greeks had tried force, they had tried alliances, and they had tried relentless pressure. Now they would try trickery. Carpenters and craftsmen set to work. Under the command of Hippias, a master builder, the great horse began to take shape. Massive timbers were hauled from the forests, their scent mingling with the smoke of the Greek camp. Day and night, hammers struck iron, ropes were pulled taut, and the structure rose from the ground like a monument to both devotion and deceit. Its flanks were smooth, its head noble and imposing, its legs thick and strong. Inside, a hidden chamber was crafted, capable of housing the finest warriors chosen for this final gamble. Meanwhile, the Greek camp prepared for the ruse. Fires were extinguished, tents were struck, and supplies were loaded onto ships. The appearance of a full withdrawal was to be convincing. Soon only the horse remained, gleaming in the sunlight, its wooden hide hiding the steel within. The Trojans, watching from their walls, were bewildered. The plain that had been alive with enemy activity for a decade now lay eerily silent. Smoke from the departing fleet trailed toward the horizon. Could it be true? Had the Greeks finally abandoned their quest? For the first time in years, the wind carried no war cries. Priam, now aged and worn by grief, called for counsel. His sons, Paris, Deiphobus and Helenus, spoke their minds. Paris, bitter and wounded by the years of struggle his choices had unleashed, urged caution but secretly hoped the Greeks had left for good. Deiphobus, more pragmatic, suggested the horse might be a trap. Others, more eager for the war's end, saw it as a sign of the gods' favor. Then came the voices of two Trojans who would become pivotal in this moment. Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, and Cassandra, the cursed prophetess and daughter of Priam. Laocoon, suspicious of Greek gifts, urged his people to destroy the horse, to burn it or break it apart before it could bring ruin. His famous words echoed across the assembly, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." Cassandra, burdened by her gift of true prophecy that no one would ever believe, cried out as well. She foresaw the doom that lurked within the wooden frame, but her warnings were met with scorn. For years, her predictions had been ignored, and now, in this moment of fragile hope, no one wished to hear her doom-laden voice. The Trojans debated long into the day. Some urged to bring the horse into the city as a trophy of their hard-won victory, a symbol that the Greeks had fled and left their offering to the gods behind. Others, more cautious, feared desecrating a divine gift might bring Athena's wrath upon Troy. It was a moment of pride, of weariness, and of longing for peace, and such moments breed fatal mistakes. The fates too played their hand. As Laocoon prepared a sacrifice to appease the gods, two great serpents emerged from the sea, their bodies coiling and thrashing as they made for the shore. In a horrifying display, they seized Laocoon and his sons, crushing them in their coils before vanishing again into the waves. The Trojans, shaken by the sight, interpreted this as a sign that Laocoon had offended the gods by speaking against the sacred horse. The decision was made. With great ceremony, the gates of Troy were opened, and the horse was dragged inside. Ropes strained, wheels groaned, and songs of triumph filled the streets. The people rejoiced, believing the long nightmare was finally over. They placed the horse near the temple of Athena, decorating it with flowers and garlands, and feasted late into the night. For the first time in a decade, the fires of war seemed to have cooled. But beyond the horizon, the Greek fleet waited. The soldiers hidden within the wooden belly of the horse remained silent, gripping their swords and spears in the dark, listening to the distant songs of their unsuspecting foes. The trap was set. Night fell upon Troy like a soft shroud. The city, for so long vigilant and battle-ready, now surrendered to celebration and sleep. Wine flowed, music played, and the weary citizens rejoiced beneath the stars. Fires burned in the streets, casting long shadows upon the high walls that had defied so many assaults. Yet among the revelers, a few uneasy hearts remained. Cassandra, ever tormented by her visions, wept in silence, and Aeneas, a young Trojan prince, felt a stirring of unease that he could not name. Inside the wooden horse, the chosen warriors endured a torturous wait. Among them were Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, and other veterans of the long war. They were cramped, their armor clinking softly with each shift, their breaths shallow in the suffocating dark. Each creak of the wood, each distant cheer from the streets, was a reminder that their lives balanced on the edge of discovery. At last, the fires of the city began to dim. One by one, the sounds of joy gave way to the quiet of deep slumber. When the hour was darkest, Odysseus gave the signal. A small hatch, hidden among the carved planks, opened silently. One by one, the Greeks emerged like phantoms into the sleeping city. Their first task was to kill the sentries and open the gates. Shadows flitted along the walls, throats were cut before cries could be raised, and the massive wooden doors that had resisted siege for 10 years creaked open to the night. Beyond them, the hidden Greek fleet surged forward, their sails black against the moonlit sea. The army, silent and grim, poured onto the shore once more. What followed was a night of fire and blood. The Greeks moved through the streets with relentless precision, setting homes and temples aflame, cutting down those who rose to resist. The very city that had stood defiant for a decade now burned like a pyre. Cries of terror filled the air, mingling with the clash of steel and the roar of collapsing roofs. Priam, the old king, sought refuge in the temple of Zeus with his family. But there, Neoptolemus found him. The son of Achilles, fierce and unrelenting, cut him down upon the altar, a grim echo of his father's wrath. Hecuba wept over her husband's body as the flames consumed the sacred hall. Elsewhere, Andromache, widow of Hector, was seized with her young son, Astyanax. In the cruelty of war, the child was hurled from the walls to prevent him from ever growing into an avenger of Troy. The women of the city, Hecuba, Andromache, Cassandra, and Helen herself, were taken as spoils, their fates entwined with the victors. Amidst this ruin, Aeneas gathered a band of survivors, carrying his father Anchises upon his shoulders and leading his young son Ascanius by the hand. Guided by omens and the will of the gods, he fled the burning city, setting in motion the long journey that would, in distant generations, lead to the founding of Rome. The wooden horse, once a symbol of supposed peace, now loomed in the heart of the burning city, its hollow belly empty at last, its purpose fulfilled. Flames licked its sides as the dawn approached, turning its surface to blackened ash. By morning Troy was no more. Its proud walls lay in ruins, its streets choked with smoke, its people slain or enslaved. The war that had begun with a single abduction, a single act of desire and pride, had ended in the total annihilation of a once great city. For the Greeks, victory was hollow. Their ships, laden with treasure and captives, would face storms, betrayals, and curses on their return journeys. Many would never see their homes again. Odysseus would wander for years, Menelaus would find his wife but lose his peace, and the legacy of Troy would live on not as a triumph, but as a warning. The wooden horse became a symbol for the ages, a reminder of how cunning can overcome strength, how pride can blind the wise, and how the gods, when they choose to meddle, often bring ruin to both the victor and the vanquished. Thus ended the War of Troy, not with a final battle, but with a deception that has echoed through the halls of history ever since. The night that would seal Troy's fate was deceptively quiet. For 10 long years the city had endured sieges, battles, truces, and betrayals, but this night felt different. The fires in the camps outside the walls had gone out, and the sea breeze carried no sound of Greek war drums. The massive wooden horse stood proudly in the heart of Troy, garlanded with flowers and surrounded by prayers of victory. Priests had declared it a gift to Athena, a symbol of Greek surrender and a plea for mercy to the goddess of war and wisdom. The Trojans, exhausted by a decade of war, wanted to believe it. They wanted the nightmare to end. King Priam, old and weary, stood upon the steps of his palace, watching his people dance and feast. The city was alive with hope for the first time in years. Markets reopened, wine flowed, and music echoed through the marble streets. Yet, in the shadows, a few wary voices lingered. Cassandra, cursed to see the future but never to be believed, wept silently in the temple. Laocoon, the priest who had warned them that Greeks bear gifts with treachery, was gone, dragged into the sea by serpents said to be sent by the gods themselves. His warning was dismissed as an ill omen against the will of Athena. Inside the wooden horse, the Greek warriors waited in suffocating silence. Odysseus, cunning and restless, tightened his grip on his sword. Menelaus, thirsting for the blood of Paris and the return of Helen, whispered prayers to Ares. Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles, burned with a cold rage to avenge his father's death. They could hear the distant sounds of joy, the celebration of the city that thought itself victorious. As the moon rose higher, the winds shifted. Far beyond the horizon, on the dark waters of the Aegean, the Greek fleet was returning. They had only pretended to sail away, hiding behind a nearby island, waiting for this signal. The city gates, tall and iron-bound, were unguarded for the first time in years. The people of Troy slept in drunken relief, their weapons laid aside. Midnight came. A small hatch on the belly of the wooden horse creaked open. One by one the Greeks slipped out, their faces blackened with ash to blend into the night. They moved like shadows, cutting the throats of sentries, unlocking the gates and lighting the prearranged beacons. From the distant shore the fleet saw the signal fire flare. Silent oars cut through the water. The Greeks were coming back. In the palace, Hecuba stirred from uneasy dreams. The queen of Troy, aged by sorrow, walked through the hall lined with statues of gods who had abandoned them. She thought of her sons, Hector, noble and fallen, Paris, reckless and cursed, and the many others lost to the war. She thought of Cassandra's warnings and felt a coldness in her chest. Something was terribly wrong. By the time the first screams rang out, it was too late. Greek soldiers poured through the gates like a black tide. Fires were set to the granaries, the barracks, and the temples. The sky turned red with smoke and the smell of burning cedar. Women woke to the sound of steel on stone. Children were dragged from their beds. Troy, the city that had defied kings and gods for a decade, was finally undone by its own trust. King Priam was roused from his slumber by the chaos. Clad in his royal robes, he fled to the altar of Zeus within his palace, clutching the ancient scepter of Troy. There, amidst the flickering torches, he prayed for a miracle. But no miracle came, only death carried in the hands of Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, who burst into the hall with blood-stained sword. Priam's pleas fell on deaf ears. The old king was struck down upon the altar, his blood mingling with the ashes of his gods. Helen meanwhile wandered the palace like a ghost. She had heard the clamor, the clash of bronze, the cries of men dying in the streets. Was this her doing? Was this city burning because of her beauty, her choices, her curse? Menelaus found her in the eastern wing, torchlight glinting off her tear-streaked face. For a heartbeat, his sword trembled in the air, ready to end her life. But even in the ruin of Troy, her beauty bewitched him. He lowered his blade and ordered her to follow him. Helen would return to Greece, not as a queen of Troy, but as a prisoner of war and a symbol of a war that consumed thousands. The slaughter spread. From the harbor to the citadel, the cries of the dying filled the air. Temples were looted, statues shattered, treasures stolen. The Greeks, after 10 years of frustration, showed no mercy. Some said even the gods turned their faces away, for the smoke of Troy rose high enough to stain Olympus itself. By dawn, the city was unrecognizable. Only the great walls, blackened by flame, still stood, mocking the lives that had been lost defending them. Aeneas, a Trojan prince and distant cousin of Priam, gathered what few survivors he could, his father Anchises on his back, his young son by his side, and a band of loyal followers. Guided by the will of the gods, he slipped through the northern gate and disappeared into the hills. His destiny would not be to fall with Troy, but to carry its legacy westward. The sun rose over a city of ashes. The fire still burned, licking at the shattered towers and fallen gates. Smoke choked the air, and the sea reflected a horizon streaked with red. The Greek army now occupied every corner of Troy, rounding up prisoners, dividing spoils, and dragging the once proud nobles in chains. Neoptolemus stood on the steps of the ruined palace, his armor splattered with the blood of kings. In his hand was the sword of Achilles, passed to him by Odysseus as a mark of vengeance fulfilled. Yet in his heart there was no triumph, only a cold, hollow fury. He had avenged his father by killing Priam, but the cost was a city drowned in screams. Odysseus, the architect of the wooden horse, walked among the ruins with a calculating gaze. For him, the destruction of Troy was not merely revenge, it was strategy. He ordered the temples stripped of their treasures, the archives seized, the remaining ships loaded with gold and captives. Among the spoils was the Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena said to guard the city. Without it, the Greeks claimed, Troy's spirit was broken forever. The fate of the Trojan women was sealed in a brutal lottery. Hecuba, the aged queen, was taken as a slave to Odysseus. Cassandra, the cursed prophetess, was dragged away by Agamemnon, her visions of doom unheeded until the very end. Andromache, the widow of Hector, was given to Neoptolemus, forced to bear the child of the man who had slain her husband. Their wails echoed in the smoking streets as the Greeks divided the human spoils of war. Menelaus, true to his word, spared Helen's life. She sailed with him at dawn, her face hidden beneath a black veil as the city that had crowned her queen crumbled behind her. Some say she wept, others say her eyes gleamed with relief. The poets would argue for centuries whether she was a victim or a temptress, a pawn of the gods or the spark of 1,000 ships. Throughout the day the Greeks desecrated the sacred sites of Troy. The great temple of Apollo was ransacked. The sanctuary of Athena, once thought inviolable, was stripped bare. Only the tomb of Hector was spared, for even the cruelest of warriors dared not disturb the resting place of Troy's greatest hero. As night fell once more, a storm gathered over the sea. Thunder rolled and lightning cracked across the horizon. The gods, it seemed, had not been absent after all. Poseidon churned the waves, Athena whispered curses. The Greeks, burdened with plunder and prisoners, now faced the wrath of the heavens. Their homecoming, foretold by omens, would be as bloody and cursed as the war itself. Some ships were wrecked before they even left the bay. Ajax the Lesser, who had defiled the temple of Athena, was struck by a sudden storm and dragged into the sea, never to rise again. Others, like Menelaus, wandered for years before reaching their homeland. Odysseus himself would be cast upon endless seas, his journey to Ithaca cursed by the very gods he had tried to appease. And what of Troy? Its walls remained, but its people were gone. Aeneas, carrying the hearth gods of his ancestors, fled with his followers to found a new destiny in the west, one that poets would one day call the seed of Rome. The name of Troy would not vanish, but it would live on as a memory of pride and ruin, of beauty and betrayal, of a city that fell not because its walls were weak, but because its heart was deceived. Thus ended the war that began with a stolen bride and a golden apple. The flames of Troy marked the close of an age, the age of heroes when God still walked among men and the fate of nations could turn upon a single night's trickery. The Greeks returned home as victors, but their triumph was bitter, for in destroying Troy, they had also sown the seeds of their own suffering. The city smoldered for weeks, its ashes scattered by the sea wind, its once bustling harbors now filled with charred timbers. The songs that would be sung of its fall would echo through millennia, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning of pride, passion, and the price of war. The city of Troy lay in ruins. Smoke curled from its once proud walls, drifting into the dark sky like a shroud for the fallen. The war that had begun with a stolen queen and an oath of vengeance had ended in fire, betrayal, and sorrow. But for the Greeks, the story was far from over. Victory came with its own burdens. The gods were angered by the cruelty unleashed, families awaited their warriors' return, and the sea itself whispered of vengeance. In the immediate aftermath, the Greek leaders gathered amid the rubble to divide the spoils. Gold and silver from the temples, treasures from the royal palace, slaves taken from the Trojan households, all were claimed as the price of 10 long years of suffering. Women of noble blood, such as Queen Hecuba and Andromache, wife of Hector, were distributed among the victors. Cassandra, the doomed prophetess no one believed, was dragged away as a concubine for Agamemnon. Her warnings about the fate awaiting him went unheeded. But beneath the celebrations lay unease. The Greeks had defiled sacred temples, slaughtered innocents at the altars, and shown no mercy to the defeated. The gods of Olympus, who had played their own games throughout this war, were not done with the mortals. Athena, once a protector of many Greek heroes, now turned against them for the atrocities committed during the sack. Poseidon, lord of the seas, stirred the waters, preparing storms that would challenge their homeward journeys. Agamemnon, the high king, desired a grand return to Mycenae. He planned to sail immediately, ignoring the omens that warned of ill fortune. Menelaus, the husband who had endured so much for Helen, prepared to take her back to Sparta. The sight of her caused murmurs among the Greek ranks. Was this woman, whose beauty had sparked such endless bloodshed, worth the cost? Some said she bewitched men with a divine charm. Others whispered she was a victim of God's cruelty as much as they were. Odysseus, cunning and cautious, urged the leaders to make sacrifices before leaving. He knew the gods were fickle and that leaving without appeasing them would bring disaster. Some listened, others mocked his caution. Nestor, the wise old king, counseled patience and proper rites. But impatience ruled the hearts of many, and the fleet soon divided, some leaving under favorable winds, others delayed by disputes and omens. As the first ships departed, the sea began to show its wrath. Storms rose suddenly, scattering fleets across unknown shores. Menelaus' voyage became a wandering, driven to Egypt and faraway lands before finding his way home. Ajax the Lesser, who had defiled Cassandra at the altar of Athena, met his doom when his ship was struck by Poseidon's thunderbolt, sinking beneath the waves. Meanwhile, in Troy's smoldering ruins, the cries of the enslaved echoed. The city that had stood for centuries was now nothing more than ashes and memory. The once mighty walls, built by the gods themselves, were broken, and the lineage of Priam ended in blood. Only a few Trojans survived free, Aeneas carrying his father Anchises and leading a band of refugees, set his course toward destiny in distant lands. His journey would one day give rise to a new empire. The Greeks who survived began to see the victory as hollow. 10 years of war had claimed their strongest warriors. Achilles lay in his tomb, Patroclus long gone, Hector slain, and countless others perished. Even the victor's glory was stained with loss, for many returned to empty homes, faithless wives, or rebellious kingdoms. The gods had used them as pawns, and now the game was over, leaving them scattered like broken pieces on the board of fate. Odysseus' story would become the most famous of these returns, the Nostoi. His journey, filled with monsters, witches, and divine wrath, would take 10 more years. But in this moment, as the fires of Troy faded into the horizon, none knew their exact fate. Only the gods watched, smiling or scowling from Olympus, as the men who had destroyed a city now set forth to face the price of their deeds. The memory of Troy would haunt them all, its smoke clinging to their sails, its curses echoing in their dreams. For some, like Nestor, the return would be peaceful. For others, like Agamemnon, it would end in blood upon their own palace floors. The war was over, but the curse of Troy had only begun. The journey home for the Greeks became a second Odyssey, less celebrated but no less tragic. As the fleet scattered across the wine-dark sea, the alliances that had once united them began to crumble. Old rivalries resurfaced, greed turned allies into enemies, and the gods played their final hand. Agamemnon reached Mycenae at last, bringing with him Cassandra and the spoils of war. His homecoming, however, was not one of joy. His wife, Clytemnestra, who had long nursed hatred for him for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia at Aulis, plotted revenge. With her lover Aegisthus, she welcomed Agamemnon with false smiles and a warm feast. As he bathed, the conspirators struck. He was murdered in his own halls, and Cassandra met her end alongside him. Thus, the leader of the Greek host, Victor of Troy, fell not in battle but by the hands of his own household. Menelaus and Helen faced storms that drove them far from Sparta, wandering through Cyprus, Phoenicia, and Egypt. Their reunion was strained. Some say he forgave her, others claim he never trusted her again. It took years before they finally returned to their throne, where Helen lived out her days under the shadow of her past. Diomedes returned to Argos only to find his kingdom turned against him. Odysseus, as the tales later sung, faced perhaps the hardest trial of all, Poseidon's wrath and a decade-long odyssey filled with shipwrecks, temptresses, and lost companions. Nestor alone returned peacefully, the gods sparing the old man who had often counseled restraint. The sons of Troy, few in number, scattered as exiles. Aeneas, bearing the household gods of Troy, sailed westward, his fate intertwined with prophecies that spoke of a new city rising where the old had fallen. His tale would be told by the Romans as the founding myth of their empire, a thread spun from the ashes of Ilium. In Greece, the memory of the war became a curse. Cities weakened by the loss of their men faced revolts and famine spread. Some saw it as divine punishment for the cruelty at Troy, the slaughter of King Priam, the murder of infants, the desecration of temples. Temples were built to appease Athena and Poseidon, sacrifices offered to cleanse the sins of war. And what of the women of Troy? They became the silent scars of victory, Hecuba enslaved and broken, Andromache forced to bear the child of her husband's killer, Cassandra's prophecies ending in silence. Their lamentations became the songs sung by bards, their tears the rivers upon which history floated. For the Greeks, the return from Troy marked the end of an age, the age of heroes. No longer would the sons of men walk with gods upon the same battlefield. The world grew colder, more distant from Olympus. The names of Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and Agamemnon became legends, their deeds sung to remind mortals of glory and its cost. The ruins of Troy, left behind, became a monument to hubris and desire. Travelers in later ages would gaze upon the mounds of stone and wonder at the folly that burned so brightly and so briefly. The war that began for love ended in ruin for all, Greeks and Trojans alike. Thus closed the great cycle of the Trojan War, a tale not only of heroism and rage but also of the price of pride, the fickleness of gods, and the frailty of human ambition. The ships had sailed, the fires had died, but the echoes remained, etched in the memory of the world, carried in every wave of the Aegean Sea.